Welcome to Unveiling Death. I am Rabbi Jeffrey Weil. Hinduism and Death, a conversation with Dr. Vijay Satnarine. Vijay Satnarine is the Director of Education for the Hindu American Foundation, at which he prepares educational materials for Hindu Americans and for the broader American public. Dr. Satnarine strives to bring compassionate ancestral techniques to difficult conversations and to transmit the teachings of his ancestors with integrity and relevance for our times. He is also an acharya, a priest and senior scholar highly versed in Hindu scripture. Dr. Satnarine lives in Orlando, Florida. Acharya Vijay Satnarine, I'm so pleased that you are here for this episode of Unveiling Death. Thank you for talking to me.
Thank you for having me, Jeffrey.
So we're talking about Hinduism and death. And, people in America certainly are familiar with lots of Hindu concepts. And when I say concepts, I probably just mean, maybe have a misconception of those concepts. Things like nirvana or moksha, karma we use a lot, and yoga, like those kinds of terms. So I'm wondering, in what way are those terms related to or fit into the Hindu concept of death and what happens to us after we die?
Thank you so much for that question. It is lovely that some of the words are, comported through to American society, but of course they come with their own understandings, some of them Instagram worthy and some of them dictionary worthy, but we try our best,
Right.
I think especially with the latter two, karma and also nirvana or moksha, they get taught in various ways in the classroom. I think what I'd like to unpick is that your karma has been, linked inextricably to you being born in a better state in your next life. That is only the opinion of, I would say, a few philosophers, but we're taught that this is a unilateral Hindu belief at school. And because of that, there's this notion that if you do good in this life, you'll have a really good next life. And if you do bad in this life, you'll have a really bad next life as well. I don't think it's that simple, especially when you pick up the original sources of the teachings. And all it is about empowered action. That if you find yourself in a state that is undesirable in your life, you can do something about it to either change the circumstances or change the way that you go through it if you can't actually change those circumstances. It's kind of a little bit of a departure. And I would rather, people wake up to that facet of karma than think that there's some universal scale balancing that's going on every time we
Right.
speak about
Yeah.
karma.
It's interesting. So I like that idea of a universal scale balancing. I like that phrase. And I like the way that's differently conceived and formulated, how you just expressed that. And yet there is the idea of samsara, reincarnation, that is karmic, but that is part of karma as well.
Yeah, to an extent. I mean, so Sanskriti, sansara comes from this verb that is Sanskriti, passing through states. And what it basically says is that the principle that keeps us alive is like matter. It's like the natural laws. They're part and parcel of this multiverse. And just because the organism that it's keeping alive finishes its journey or their usefulness, or no longer has the ability to sustain life, it doesn't mean that that principle is extinguished when the body is. So what we're saying is not that you yourself will be reincarnated into X predictable body in the future. What we're saying is that when you die, the essence that made you inheres, persists in this multiverse. It doesn't get extinguished. It does not go anywhere alien. It's here.
Let's dig into that word essence then. Is that one's self, which then brings to mind something entirely different? Like, in other words, would my self, me as Jeffrey, have an existence when this mortal coil of mine is shed? Would that Jeffrey be inherent in another organism, or would something else be inherent of mine, that essence in another organism?
So that's a really powerful question. It's one that a lot of the philosophies, I was mentioning this to someone the other day, and they kind of understood it once I said it. So maybe it's useful. You know, we talk about the 12 tribes of Israel. We're having to think of instead, in the ancient Indian or a Hindu case, that we're talking about 4,400 tribes and people groups. So each of those different traditions comes up with different philosophies, different ways of approaching the same question, but to a degree that I don't think other world religions have that kind of ancient diversity. It was always one people or one group of initial people. Here we have various groups of various initial peoples. So when it comes to thinking about who we are, there are a few major philosophical traditions, all of whom acknowledge at the very essence of who we are doesn't lie this thing that's tied to this physical body or to all of the different social conventions that we've amassed for ourselves, not even to the experiences we've gone through, but there's something more important, more essential that is who we actually are. Everything else is an accretion. And so missionaries, of course, when they started translating or mistranslating our sources, they called what we have in Sanskrit, the word is Atman. They called that the soul.
Right.
But Atman actually simply means essential self. That when you go beyond the body, I mean, you could cut off this hand and I'd still be me. You could cut off a leg, I would still be me. Even, God forbid my head was no longer part of my body, it would still be his head. It was my head, right? It's not me. So what is me? Is it a name? Well, no, because you can go down the offices and change that, what is me? You could pick up my photos from when I was a baby, and you could pick up the photos from now and try to compare that. Is that the same person? Well, at a cellular level, maybe, but also at a cellular level, no, because our cells regenerate every 7 years or so. So who am I is what links into this question. And who am I is actually this essential, eternal principle that animates a body when it comes in contact with it. Once this is done, once this particular body is no longer able to sustain life, then life inheres in the multiverse. And when another body that's capable of sustaining life comes up, of course, life is going to be drawn upon again. And that principle, therefore, is thought to continue. I think the easiest way of imagining it is like a bucket filled with water from the ocean. Once the bucket is finished with it, or the bucket's broken, for example, no longer able to carry the water's just back in the ocean. And when you have a bucket that's good and strong and able to hold the water again, buckets
Right.
filled with water.
So I'll talk about that image of the bucket then. If the means by which, or the way through which I can stop the process of samsara, reincarnation, which I assume still is the ultimate religious goal. But if that's the ultimate goal, is to stop this reincarnation, and in order to do that, I need to, in this life, get down to the essential self, or the essential aspect of what I am. I would find that, I think that's a very appealing, compelling idea, and also is so extraordinarily difficult, because I like my bucket. And I like the things that I painted on my bucket, and I like the things that I put in my bucket, and that's all the stuff of the self and the ego and that sort of thing. And so I'm wondering, but on the other hand, it makes so much sense. But how do you, as a teacher, convey that you really want to put that bucket in some perspective?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and it's very much like the questions I would get from Hindus themselves. The central teaching that perhaps helps us differentiate between Abrahamic traditions and the Dharma traditions is not so much that we want to reach the end of reincarnation, but it's rather that we would like to stop suffering.
Yeah.
So what we say is that because we are humans, or because we are living entities in this multiverse, simply because we want things and we desire things, or because we experience things, we are going to go through ups and downs. And so samsara is more characterized as a place where there are repetitive cycles of dissatisfaction or suffering, and that we might be the cause of those, or we might be put into a situation where we're experiencing those. The real goal of the Dharma traditions is to break those cycles. That's what we are here for. And you could choose to do that in non-theist methods where you're focused more about, meditating, understanding your internal mechanisms, how your emotions are triggered, how your psychological responses become manifest, how that affects your behavior, and then really trying to zero down into finding the grounding and stability that exists at the essential level. Or it could go all the way through to the monotheist devotion in the devotional traditions that we have, where we place all of that hard work at the feet of God. And, we hope that by serving God with devotion, with faith, that God will help us relieve these burdens of suffering and sorrow. So it's really actually about not looking to a distant goal, but actually right now looking at how we manage all of the ups and downs that we go through and try to manage it a little bit better.
I see. So I think I see. So that means this notion of samsara or reincarnation as something that we typically understand as dying and coming back. It can be understood that way, but it's also understood in a this life manner.
This life now. Yeah, we have this body. This body is amazing. We have traditions of yoga to try and help manage this body a bit better. We have Tantra, which really grounds spirituality in the physical experience. We have a lot of the more philosophical and a lot more idea-based traditions that use our mind and our intellect. But we are still grounding all of our spirituality in this experience of the body. So of course, when we get to that point where, oh my, there's going to be a transition, it's going to scare the living daylights out of you, unless you've kind of worked on your mind and your understanding or your spiritual experiences to try and get the grounding that's needed to survive that transition.
Right. So there's both the sense of it happening, working on it, putting in the effort now.
Right.
And also, I guess, to work on it now in order to have some improvement in the cycle of life and death, if not a conclusion of that cycle after when we die. Is that accurate?
That's kind of accurate. And I'll just pop in there with this little asterisk. And I'll say that that's for some traditions. And then other traditions are kind of convinced that simply by being devoted to God or by spiritual practice that is non-theist, you are not looking at escaping any future cycle, but you're looking at being free from any kinds of suffering or any kind of future existences where there is suffering in this particular birth. So this will be it.
So can we talk about cremation as well? In Jewish tradition, cremation is forbidden. I'm wondering if in Hinduism, in the Hindu community, it's the opposite, actually. If the exposure to the West with the great Indian diaspora has made folks more inclined to burial as opposed to cremation.
So cremation was one of the methods that existed for the disposal of the body once the body was no longer useful for supporting life. The other methods were burial, funnily enough, and burial is still practiced in the case of children if they unfortunately pass away before the age of 5. Some cases it's the age of 2. And of those who have achieved very exalted levels of spiritual practice. So burial still continues. We have burials, that are being excavated from even 10,000 years ago, that are still, very, very much part and parcel of Hindu life. Cremation, though, is the preferred method because what ends up happening is you have culture and context to consider. India is a very populous place, and if we suddenly started burying people, we would lose vast tracts of land that is actually needed for food cultivation. So it is impractical in India to bury people. Over here, you may say, well, that challenge doesn't exist. And then we come to the second facet of cremation, which is we would like to reduce the body back to its elemental state as quickly and as hygienically as possible. so that the families can get on with the process of mourning and integrating this great loss into their life in a healthy manner. It doesn't help if there is a physical place to go back to whenever they feel sad, because what the teaching is that if you're not the body, but you are the eternal essence, you have to help that person learn to intuit and feel that eternal essence in a different way. Whereas if we're attached to this physical locality all the time, we're developing an attachment that, if it isn't monitored, can become kind of troublesome for that person to heal in the grieving process. So even now, and even though we're over here, you know, there are Hindus over here in America, there have been Hindus in the UK and other places for a very long time, they've still preferred cremation.
Are there ritual ways to do cremation in the States?
The one good thing about Hindus is we learn to adapt. We understand the essence of the ceremonies are laid out very elaborately in our, you know, in our historical sources, but they all come with the caveat of what is possible in the place and time and the context.
Right.
So it's not possible over here. Well, in some places it is possible. Most places it's not possible to do open air cremations. And also it's impossible to get the kind of fuels that are needed to do a very clean cremation. So the modern crematorias rather, those are completely fine, and we've adapted our traditions to be able to use them. And Hindus use those for cremation over here, and then they try to do things with their ashes, whether that is about taking it back to the sacred rivers, or if it is simply dispersal in the ocean here, totally fine.
Is there a certain amount of time after death that cremation happens? Is it as soon as possible, for instance?
It should be before sunset on the day of death, or if it occurs at night, then before sunset the day after death. However, our communities, again, in this lovely kind of we'll adapt thing, initially when we came over here, actually it goes back a little bit further. So if you go into the 1800s, when Indians were taken as replacements for the emancipated slaves into the former colonies, the British actually forbade open air cremations, saying that they will not tolerate that kind of heathenry. And they mandated Hindus be buried in the colored cemeteries that they had designated in swampy areas. So there is actually about 3 or 4 generations worth of Hindus that are used to going back to see their ancestors in those quite sad conditions that the British had made for them. And so when they and their diaspora came to the US, and when Indians joined as well, people from Nepal and other areas in Asia, the inability for the initial legislators and policymakers to understand our requirement for 24-hour or at least 12-hour same day before sunset or before the next day's sunset requirements, we just said, all right, well, whatever you guys want us to do, we'll do. Whereas other communities have come through and said, no, we must be buried before X amount of time, and policymakers have listened to that. So we're a little bit of an imbalance that way, but we'll manage.
Jewish tradition is burial as soon as possible.
Yeah.
And that's at least the traditional tradition. And
Yep.
we all kind of know that, but usually in the non-Orthodox or non-traditional communities, which I am part of and lead such a community, it's not that. I mean, I don't think of the many funerals that I've done, it's been almost exclusively at least a couple of days. And sometimes Jews now feel like the tradition, it's too abrupt to say, in a sense, to say goodbye to somebody
Right.
within 24 hours. I understand that. Has that come up as well in your practice?
Yeah, actually, we're lucky again. We have so much diversity. There are old stories from 3,000 and 4,000 years ago, where beloved person X passed away while their family were overseas, and they kept the body immersed in oil as a way of preserving the body until the family member returned months later, and that's when they had their cremation. So there are stories from then that we use as precedent to say, well, if we're waiting for family to come in from overseas or far away in the States, then we'll hold off. And then some just prefer that if there's organ donation going on, or if there's a post-mortem, or even just for the sake of, it's really hard to reschedule everything in your life. As traumatic as death is, the daily stuff has to go on. How do you reschedule all of that, prepare for a funeral, find everything, get all your licenses, and et cetera, et cetera. They prefer the couple of days in between. But if things were a little bit more streamlined, I can see a good number of Hindus using the 24-hour rule as well.
I see. Organ donation, you mentioned. Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Are there religious implications to that? Is it encouraged, discouraged?
Is a gray area. I'll say that there are a lot of people that would prefer that they are cremated whole, that their entire body is cremated. But then other people will also remember that we have a very ancient medical tradition. And the medical tradition's insights, the founders were Charaka and Sushruta, so about 500 years BCE in one case, and 800 years BC in the other. They actually gained their medical insights by performing postmortems and doing medical research on cadavers. So we're talking about people giving up, the loved one's body for days at a time. Because of that, there is another memory of organs being used for advancing medical science. There is this openness, but also a kind of reticence, and so it's up to each person to reconcile with their spiritual teachers or with their family members if there's no spiritual teacher, how that goes about. And some people are like, I don't really care, I just want to donate my organs. And other people are like, don't touch me, I want to go as I am.
Right. The "don't touch me" tradition in Judaism, which is also, it's gray and it's challenged, is really because we are, the Jewish tradition at least is pretty bodily. In other words, there's this traditional belief, at least. I wouldn't say that most non-traditional Jews believe this, but a traditional belief of a actual physical resurrection. That's when the Messiah comes. I think it's a contrast with Hinduism. I mean, it's very body focused. I mean, Ezekiel 37, the bones being clanging back together and sinews coming back and flesh and so forth. So this bucket traditionally endures.
That's such a lovely story. I mean, we have got people like that, some traditions like that prefer the entire body to be cremated, not because it will be resurrected, but because there is this complete finality to the use of this body. So there is no tethers for the and in their traditions, so that there's no tethers for this this person's essence to continue in their journey. I had asked this question to a Roman Catholic friend of mine, a priest, and he says, we're mostly of the opinion that the resurrection needs the body, but I also cremated my grandmother's remains in accordance with her wishes. And I said, you're a priest, doesn't that cause issues? And he says, well, you would want to think that if the creator of this entire universe could pull everything together as the creator did, that the creator would be able to find whatever scattered remains existed, resurrect the person as they were. So I thought that was a really interesting answer from someone who's in a really very strictly bodily resurrection tradition.
You mentioned that young children, God forbid, under 5 or under 2, would be buried. I understand why religious luminaries might be buried. I can understand that. Why children?
The thought is that because they're too young to make consciously evil decisions, consciously bad decisions. When I say evil, I want to use the word a bit more nuanced. Decisions that are at the expense of another. Those kinds of decisions or thoughts or actions, they kind of start the process of a human becoming a little bit too complex to be considered saintly. And because they're at this innocent stage, it is thought that they are as close to innocence as they can be, similar in a way that someone who's worked to get rid of all of this stuff will attain that childlike state and then be eligible for burial.
Wow. That is really something. So in other words, it's really the same reason for a religious leader or whatever,
Right.
of a high status and a God forbid, again, a 2-year-old or 3-year-old. It's the same
Right.
reason that they would be buried as opposed to cremated, is because their spiritual level.
Yeah, their spiritual level. And also, I mean, again, we were talking about coming over here. Lots of families now feel, especially those unfortunately who go through miscarriage or early child death, that they want their children to be cremated as well. And we would say there's no problem if you want it to do that way as well. There's no problem. But that the tradition of burial is there should they want to choose it. And a lot of them choose cremation. So it's all very fluid at the moment.
So the question I have been concluding these conversations with is a more personal question. What song do you want to hear as you lay dying?
I'll give you the traditional answer. And the traditional answer is that we use mantras. Mantras can be, if you're in a monotheist tradition, the name of God, and they usually are sung very nicely, and people have their favorites. And so maybe one of those would be nice, as well as just hearing the chants of the sources of knowledge, the ancient teachings. That would be nice too, especially the Bhagavad Gita. Just hearing that on the way out.
Nice. So the traditional chanting of the Bhagavad Gita, traditional Hindu text. Yeah. Well, Acharya Vijay Satnarine, this has been a really fascinating conversation. I really appreciate your time and for your being on Unveiling Death.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks as always to my creative director, editor, and son, Sammy Weil. Thanks to my band, the Night Owls of Chicago, for the music you are listening to right now. Coming to Montrose Saloon on November 23rd. And thank you for listening to Unveiling Death, Eternity in about 24 minutes, every other Monday.